thank you both for this film and for being with us tonight. I'll start with Joanna. I've heard you talk about this as a film you've had in mind for some time. At the same time, it seems to be a film that emerges from more recent work, as in the characters of Julie and Rosalind are familiar from the Souvenirs 1 and 2. So can you talk a little bit about how, this sense of an older project, but also picking up strands from something more recent?
Yes, I'll try. Yes, I mean, since maybe even the early 2000s, I've thrown around in my head mostly an idea of doing something based on my relationship with my mother. But I always sort of derailed myself in a way, feeling like I didn't have the right. I mean, just as Julie says, that I didn't have the right to speak about someone else, particularly my mother. And so it took many years. And then when we made the Souvenirs, we got very close to Rosalind and Julie, obviously, but Rosalind. And then somehow the fictionalizing of my mother in Rosalind in the Souvenirs, she became someone else. She became part Tilda, a bit Tilda's mother, my mother, myself. So the distance helped. So the guilt faded away a little bit.
So when you started thinking about this, it sounds like 20 years ago, did you think of it as a ghost story?
No. It was a mother and daughter going away to stay in a hotel, but it didn't have that element. But I think actually what happened, I was thinking the other day that when we were all at home in 2020, we were all thinking about ghosts in a way. We were thinking about our own mortality, grief. Certainly for me, I didn't lose anyone, fortunately, in that time. But I thought, a lot about my own death and other people's death. And of course, my mother's death, because she was still alive then in her 90s. So that feeling of death in the air, in a sense, brought out the ghost story in The Eternal Daughter.
And maybe this is a good point to I think people probably know, but it might be a good moment to talk about how you work, which is a very particular way of working, which is you arrive, on set having written, but not having written lines necessarily. You've thought about the film and you have something in mind, but you figure out scene by scene with your actors. Well, your actor, I should. And I just wonder, at what stage did you? I'm just thinking about how you work and how complicated it must have been for one actor to be playing two characters, given your way of working. So, when did you decide that Tilda would play? I don't know whose decision it was, but I'm curious when it happened that Tilda would play both Julie and Rosalind, because you do play a Rosalind in the Souvenir films.
Well, I want to Tilda to answer this really, but briefly to say that that when Tilda suggested brilliantly the idea that she would play both roles, pretty much in sort of my next thought was, well, how will I be able to work in the way that I usually work? Then it'll all be about trickery. And I was really not interested in playing tricks. And so it was a real challenge to be able to shoot in story order, not have a written script, not plan, and yet have this idea of Tilda talking to herself, in a sense. So it was an incredible credit to Tilda. What seems very seamless because she makes it look so easy, but it was quite a thing to do and to embody two characters in such a distinct way. But I was very happy that I could keep this way of working because it gave Tilda and I a huge amount of freedom to play and develop the characters and the story as we went along.
So Tilda, it was your idea.
Well, it was my suggestion. It was it was a provocation, I would say. I mean, it was, we'd started talking about the film and we'd sort of begun assuming that I'd play Julie. And we talked for a while about finding someone older to play the mother, who at that point was not called Rosalind. We didn't know for a while that they were going to be Julie and Rosalind. They were a woman and her mother. And then we became so attached to Rosalind during the Souvenirs. And Joanna and I talked a lot, even though the Souvenirs are so much about Julie and her journey and her becoming a filmmaker. The relationship with the mother was very strong for us. And we became very tantalized by particularly a relationship between a mother of the age of our mothers and a daughter of our age. Something about the spanning of the generation gap between us two sort of tranches was felt to us very untapped. And the layers of unspokenness, which, by the way, brings us to Joanna's way of working, because in many ways, I would say, yes, there were some technical challenges, but it's grace. I mean, it's always grace to work in that way, but with this particular material, it was the jewel, because it's all about not knowing what to say and trying to dredge up some utterance that might fill the gap, the unbridgeable gap between these two people. And so because it's all about the inarticulacy between the two of them, it's unimaginable to me that one would approach this kind of material with a written script by a screenwriter who might be interested in people being articulate and saying what they mean and being able to hear each other. That was really, that was not what we were really interested in. And so working in this incredibly free way with these two particular people, because they are very particular, both of them, both of them very quiet people who aren't big talkers, finding utterances it was a game.
But it was so much about Tilda and I, so it was about our mothers or in that sense, but it was so much a conversation between us. And that was the joy of working in this way, is that the conversation could develop. It wasn't set up beforehand. So we were really, we were sort of playing the two characters on some level,
taking turns,
and developing the story in that way. So it came out of a deep, very long friendship that we've had. That yes, we could only reach that depth because of knowing each other as well as we do.
But I think what's amazing is that it's not just. It's so far from a gimmick. I mean, it is the conceptual brilliance of the film, actually. I think that that Tilda is playing both characters. I think that's so essential to the film that you made.
Well, now you've seen the film, and now we've made it. We realize it could only be that way. Yeah. So even talking about the possibility of Rosalind and Julie being played by two different people, right. It's sort of preposterous. Oh, it's a different film. It's something else.
It would have become something else, and maybe it would have gone in another direction. Sure. But as it is, it's so right, and yes, a lot to do with how Tilda played Rosalind in the Souvenirs. That she was really fascinating. We wanted to just know more about her.
So did you think of this as the Rosalind from the Souvenirs? You did?
Yes. And for me, that was the key to separating from my mother, that I could let go of what she might think of the film, because these two characters existed already.
And you thought of this as the Julie several decades on.
Yeah. I mean, I questioned whether that was a good idea, because this is not, as you will all have seen, a third part. It's not it's not a trilogy, but it's something very different. But
it is and it isn't, right? I mean, it's sort of
there are connections, obviously.
Yeah. But I think that it's also another, stroke of genius to have a film that is a continuation, but in a completely different register. So if you can talk a little bit about I love that you really are leaning into the supernatural. You know, you're playing with all kinds of horror and ghost story conventions and tropes, and embracing some of them and subverting some of them. And if you can, at a certain moment, we see that Julie is reading the Kipling story. So that was, a nice citation of sorts. I'm just wondering if you can talk about what else you had in mind of really inhabiting and playing with the genre.
Well, it was just so exciting, exactly, to play in that way. And I've always been really scared of ghost films, certainly horror films. I find really difficult to watch. I sort of want to watch them and I don't, that thing. And it was a challenge to make something a bit scary, but I know, and it's interesting to know what you will think, but it's not following all the rules of the genre, but I feel it's entirely, how to put it, the sort of emotional landscape is a very ghostly one, and I feel the relationship of Julie and Rosalind in the way that it is, it's just so naturally about ghosts, and I think personally I've thought or did think about my mother's passing for I was always worried about it from being a young child, and I was always scared of the dark, and there was somehow unconsciously a connection between my fear of the dark and my fear of losing my mother. So that wrapping up of genre and this story was I can't separate them actually, but I did enjoy the tropes of the ghost film.
Mm-hmm. Just to come back to how you worked, I'm curious, just scene to scene, you shoot in story order, as you say. So in a given scene, do you start with Julie or Rosalind, or was it dependent on the scene?
Slightly depended. So Joanna writes a document, which is a sort of, it's almost like a short story, really, with no specific dialogue. And some detail, but very little, just sort of emblematic pointers. But she might say, it's the first evening, it's the first dinner. Action, basically. And we would sort of decide before, come to some sort of understanding of what we might discuss on that first evening. We had a sort of basic outline in our minds of the trajectory of these 3 dinners, for example, and where we might end up. Not exactly where we ended up, but sort of where we might end up. So we knew that in the first dinner, for example, we might begin to talk about Rosalind's memories of the dining room. And we would figure out that the person who kind of led that conversation was, on that occasion, Julie. So we started by shooting Julie's side. And we shot, and then we stopped shooting Julie, and then I went away, and somehow Rosalind appeared and came back, and we all tried to remember what we'd done on Julie's side, and some people had made some notes and other people had forgotten to take notes, and we just sort of tried to piece it together. But and then sometimes it was Rosalind who started the conversation, and so we would shoot Rosalind first. But when that first person was being shot, Joanna was beside the camera. So we were sort of mapping out, sort of drafting the conversation and together. And then for the second person, it was all just me trying to remember and make sense of it.
So it came out of a conversation in a way between us, but then it turned around. But the document I wrote, the challenge with this particular document was to write a ghost story. So I didn't see it as a film to begin with. I saw it as, well, I'm going to really try and write a short ghost story, a kind of scary story. And so it reads much more like a short story than a script.
I'm just going to ask one more, and then we'll open it up. I'm curious about this question of guilt that you brought up, and I'm wondering if that applied with the Souvenir as well, where you were also, I mean, it's much, and also a very personal film also a film in which you are fictionalizing people you knew, and whether this film or any film is a process of working through that guilt, or if that guilt remains.
Yeah, well, guilt is the theme in my life, and there was definitely guilt in making the souvenirs, and it wasn't so much about my mother in that case, but it was other people, and I think it's just the feeling of, well, I keep using phrases that come from the film, but trespassing, somehow trespassing on other people's lives, and I feel really uneasy about that, and it's a very interesting kind of moral question in a way of you know, what are our rights as creators, and I feel on some level we should be able to write whatever we want, but I'm maybe too sensitive to just sort of let myself off the hook in that way. So it'll probably continue to be a thing.
But I remember even with the souvenirs, and you had wanted to make the souvenir for so long, and were stopping yourself by thinking, well, my memories aren't clear enough yet. Somehow you thought, you had a fantasy that at some point your memories were going to sort of crystallize into some sort of lexicon that you could then follow. And then, in my view, my darling friend, this moment came when you realized that it was never going to happen, and that memories are slippery beasts, and that anyway they don't even really properly belong to you. So you might as well just make a stab at it and make it up as well, that making it up is just as good as having some crystal clear memory. In fact, maybe even better if you're a filmmaker. And I imagine that going through that exercise with your own memories and your own past may have given you more of a license to approach this subject about your mother. Maybe, I don't know.
I really think that's true. I hadn't thought of it like that. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple of audience questions. So we'll start right here. The question is about memory as sort of the third character in the film, and how that comes across in writing and acting.
Well, I don't think it was. I don't think you can really write it. I think it came out of the making of the film. I think. Well, there were certain memories that did connect with my mother. I guess. I mean, I forget. I really, my memory's not very good. There were certain touchstones, but it's so hard to unpick at this point how it all happened. I mean, I sat watching it, which is a rare thing, and I find it really hard to watch the film. I usually don't watch my films after they're finished, and I'm sitting there wanting to re-edit it, actually. But I don't know how it all came about.
Well, I think this is partly the magic of this way of working, because to be very sort of reductive, and please forgive me for saying this about written scripts, because of course they can be wonderful, wonderful things, but the problem with written scripts is that they have to be achieved. There's a sort of box ticking exercise to a certain extent, and the wonderful thing about working in this way is that there's no bar. You're looking for a sort of feeling. You're trying to get a sort of wavelength, a frequency. It's like, I mean, when I watch the film, as I did just now also, and I see Julie looking, she's like a dog. She's like a pointer. It's not just that she's listening, she's feeling. And now that you've seen the film, you'll know that she's listening for and feeling for Rosalind, not just listening to the creaky old house. And when we were making it, I hesitate to use the word performance, because it in many ways isn't a performance. It's, I hope, the least performative performance, that one of the most, I hope, that one can achieve, because it was so important that it not be performative. But it is a sort of tuning in to a frequency. And when we were doing it, and I say we because it was really like Joanna and I were doing it together. When I was playing Rosalind, for example, I found myself speaking in this way. It was very important to us that they had the same voice, for obvious reasons, but the vernacular she uses, the way, the words she uses, the way she sort of passes out her words was pure my mother. I do not know where that came from. It wasn't conscious, it wasn't an idea that I decided, it wasn't something that Joanna had asked me to do. It was like we got into a groove. We kind of called something up and we followed this trail through the air. And it was only achievable because of the way we were working. And that sort of memory, I'm coming around a long, long series of houses to say that was like memory working in us. It was sort of, how did they talk? They said this, and it came up within us as we worked. Now, if Joanna had written it down, or somebody else had written it down months before, we could never have got there. We could never have found this particular sort of music. It was sort of musical, the way we were working. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but it felt very sort of elliptical and blind. We were blind, really. But there was something about following the music where the memory of the way they spoke came out of the way in which Joanna works.
And not just with Tilda, not just with anybody in front of the camera, but actually behind the camera. There was, particularly with this shoot, a kind of channeling going on. So we're all in some kind of a trance in this house, because it's very atmospheric, this house. Some of us were living in it, which was terrifying. And a lot of things were seen and heard during the shoot, whether they were imagined or not, we don't know. But there's I mean, I'm sort of saying it, what you've just said in a different way. I mean, there's such an intensity to the way we were working. That's why a question like yours, which is a wonderful question about memory, I just can't unpick while I'm sitting here, because we're doing something in the present tense. And then for me, once it's gone in the present tense, it's gone and I can't retrieve it. So I can't really tell you how, from my point of view, how we did things at this point.
I'm getting the sign that we have to wrap up, but I have to ask a question about Louis. Who is Tilda's dog?
Well, for those of you who've seen the Souvenir films, you will have met Louis's relations. In the first film, his mother, Rosie, his aunt, Dora. And in the second Souvenir film, Rosie and Dora were joined by his nephew, Snow Bear. And when we made the second Souvenir, there was a sort of slight casting issue around Louis, and Joanna was keen on him. And I, with strange foresight, said, no, we're going to wait. We're going to hold him for a solo show. And that was a wise call. And I have to tell you, we had a screening in Venice, where I live. Joanna very kindly brought the film up to show to two dear elderly friends of mine who otherwise wouldn't be able to see it. And Louis came and sat and watched the film. And he was so happy, not because he appreciated the film, but because once again he was taken out by himself from that pack and separated out from his sister, who's the bane of his life. And he had the time of his life making this film. He loved it, absolutely loved every minute.
But he was upset when we finished.
Did you work with him the same way? Did he also have to find his lines?
Well,
scene by scene.
He was the best improviser in the world, and but he felt the story. Actually, at the end, it was a bit distressing because he looked a bit distressed when Julie's going off in the taxi. He was in the taxi too, and he was shaking a little bit, which was felt for him.
All right, we have to wrap it up. But Tilda and Joanna, thank you so much for tonight.